Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. Selamat pagi Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, selamat datang ke dalam acara webinar GRI-CDP Advanced Seminar, Introduction to Tcfd and SDGs. Kita akan mulai webinar ini dalam waktu 5 menit lagi, yaitu tepat pukul 9. Sementara mari kita lihat tayangan video dari SDG untuk menunggu waktu webinar kita. Silahkan host untuk menayangkan videonya. Terima kasih. Selamat pagi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Sebelumnya, saya ingin tes apakah Mbak Koli, apakah suara saya terdengar dengan jelas?
Sudah, Bu Rini, sudah jelas?
Siap. Apakah Mbak Koli juga sudah bisa melihat layar, tayangan di layar?
Di layar kebetulan masih backdrop acara, Bu Rini.
Siap, siap. Memang kebetulan pas backdrop
Baik,
acara.
oke,
Baik.
baik.
Baik, saya mulai saja, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. Selamat pagi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Puji dan syukur kita panjatkan kepada Tuhan Yang Maha Esa atas rahmat-Nya. Kita semua dalam keadaan sehat dan dapat hadir dan berpartisipasi dalam webinar kita hari ini yang bertajuk TCFD, Deep Dive Climate Risk Assessment and Scenario Analysis. Sebelum kita mulai acara ini, berikut merupakan daftar istilah yang akan banyak kita pakai untuk hari ini. Jangan khawatir jika Anda tidak dapat mengingat istilah-istilah ini, kami akan melampirkan istilah ini dalam dokumen setelah webinar ini berlangsung. Sedikit mengenai webinar ini. Webinar ini bertujuan untuk memberikan wawasan yang lebih dalam terkait panduan kerangka TCFD dan pembuatan asesmen resiko dan analisis skenario perubahan iklim. Webinar kita hari ini merupakan webinar kedua dari seri webinar yang akan kami bawakan selama tahun 2021 melalui kemitraan dengan rekan kami, GRI atau Global Reporting Initiative. Pada kesempatan ini, saya juga ingin memperkenalkan diri. Nama saya Rini Setiawati. Saat ini saya bekerja sebagai manajer dalam program Hutan CDP dan akan memandu jalannya acara webinar kita hari ini. Sebelum kita mulai, ada beberapa hal terkait pelaksanaan webinar hari ini yang perlu Anda ketahui. Yang pertama, audio untuk partisipan akan di-mute selama jalannya webinar. Lalu selanjutnya akan terdapat sesi tanya-jawab di tengah dan di akhir webinar ini. Bagi peserta yang ingin atau yang memiliki pertanyaan, silahkan tulis pertanyaan Anda melalui fitur Q&A selama webinar berlangsung. Pertanyaan Anda nanti akan dijawab oleh pemateri, baik secara tertulis maupun melalui Q&A box, ataupun dijawab secara langsung melalui sesi tanya-jawab nanti. Yang terakhir, webinar ini juga akan direkam. Rekaman akan kami bagikan kepada seluruh peserta yang sudah mendaftar. Rekaman akan tersedia dalam dua bahasa, yaitu bahasa Indonesia maupun bahasa Inggris. Materi webinar akan dibawakan dalam yang terakhir, materi webinar kita akan dibawakan dalam bahasa Inggris. Terjemahan langsung bahasa Indonesia tersedia bagi peserta yang ingin mendengarkannya. Selanjutnya, bagi Anda yang ingin mengakses terjemahan simultan, Anda dapat mengklik icon interpretation yang berada di panel bagian bawah layar Anda dan memilih ikon bahasa Indonesia. Silahkan ikuti langkah berikut di layar untuk mengakses fitur interpretasi. Jika Anda tidak ingin mendengarkan suara dari pemateri, Anda dapat mengklik tombol mute original audio yang Anda dapat lihat di layar. Nah, bagi peserta yang menggunakan handphone, Anda juga dapat menggunakan fitur interpretasi yang terdapat di Zoom, yang terdapat pada Zoom di handphone. Instruksi untuk mengakses interpretasi dapat Anda lihat di layar. Sebelum masuk ke bahasan utama, saya akan memberikan sedikit latar belakang diadakannya webinar kita hari ini. Proyek peningkatan kapasitas ini dapat terlaksana melalui pendanaan dari Department for Business, Energy, and Industry Strategy, Kerajaan Inggris, dan programnya sendiri bernama UK PACT, atau Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transition. Program ini merupakan bagian dari komitmen negara Inggris dalam mengatasi isu perubahan iklim dengan bekerja sama dengan negara-negara partner dan juga organisasi dalam mendukung percepatan transisi ke pertumbuhan bersih. CDP bersama GRI menerima pendanaan dari UK PACT untuk menjalankan program peningkatan kapasitas bagi perusahaan tercatat di Indonesia terkait dengan isu-isu lingkungan, sosial, dan tata kelola atau ESG. Dari sisi CDP, kami akan berfokus untuk memberikan informasi mengenai praktik terbaik global khususnya untuk aksi dan pelaporan lingkungan perusahaan dalam konteks TCFD. Partner kami GRI akan berfokus pada bagaimana perusahaan dapat menyelaraskan tujuan dan indikator kinerja bisnisnya dengan tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan atau SDGs. Kami membagi lokakarya ini menjadi beberapa bagian, yaitu lokakarya pemula atau beginner, dan mahir atau advance, dan lokakarya untuk pasar modal atau capital markets. Lokakarya pemula telah dilaksanakan di awal Juni lalu. Saya yakin sebagian besar dari peserta hari ini juga menghadiri lokakarya tersebut. Bagi Anda yang tidak mengikuti lokakarya pemula dan tertarik untuk mengetahui informasi dasar dari TCFD, saya menganjurkan untuk mengakses tautan yang tertera di layar. Kami akan menjalankan training selama tahun 2021. Pada hari ini dan juga besok kami akan membahas pengembangan dari lokakarya pemula dan akan menggali lebih dalam beberapa topik yang telah kita bahas di lokakarya sebelumnya. Topik hari ini dipilih berdasarkan umpan balik yang kami terima dari Perusahaan Tercatat di Indonesia yang menjawab survei yang dilakukan pada awal tahun ini. Setelah bahasan mengenai TCFD dan SDGs, topik yang paling banyak diminati oleh perusahaan tercatat adalah asesmen risiko terkait perubahan iklim dan analisis skenario perubahan iklim. Kedua bahasan tersebut merupakan komponen penting dalam konteks TCFD. Berikut merupakan keluaran yang kita harapkan pada akhir webinar ini. Pada akhir webinar ini, kami harap perusahaan dapat menjadi familiar dengan risiko terkait perubahan iklim dalam konteks rekomendasi TCFD, dan juga perusahaan diharapkan dapat mengerti elemen-elemen kunci dari praktik pengelolaan risiko perubahan iklim, dan juga perusahaan diharapkan dapat menjadi familiar dengan berbagai tipe analisis skenario perubahan iklim, dan juga perusahaan mampu mengetahui mengenai berbagai pendekatan analisis skenario perubahan iklim dan dapat mengambil langkah awal untuk memulai atau memperbaiki asesmen risiko dan analisis skenario perubahan iklim. Dan juga kami harap di akhir webinar ini perusahaan dapat mengetahui cara mendapatkan informasi mengenai asesmen risiko dan skenario analisis perubahan iklim. Sekali lagi, kami juga ingin mengucapkan terima kasih bagi para peserta dan para pemateri yang telah bergabung dalam webinar hari ini. Terima kasih sebesar-besarnya kami berikan kepada UK PACT Green Recovery Fund dan juga partner kami Global Reporting Initiative atau GRI, Kementerian Perencanaan Pembangunan Nasional atau BAPPENAS, Kedutaan Besar Inggris di Jakarta, PT Bursa Efek Indonesia, dan Indonesia Corporate Secretary Association yang telah memberikan dukungan dalam pengembangan dan pelaksanaan proyek ini. Berikut agenda kita hari ini. Materi pertama akan dibawakan oleh rekan saya, Fredrik Anderson, yang akan membawakan ringkasan dari lokakarya pemula yang diadakan awal Juni lalu. Selanjutnya, pembicara tamu kita hari ini, Miss Lau Xinyi dari Carbon Trust, akan membawakan dua sesi bahasan. Yang pertama yaitu mengenai asesmen risiko perubahan iklim yang akan diikuti oleh break selama 10 menit dan sesi tanya-jawab selama 10 menit, yang akan dilanjutkan dengan sesi kedua, yaitu pembahasan mengenai analisis skenario perubahan iklim. Di penghujung acara, kita akan juga memiliki sesi tanya-jawab terakhir yang akan diikuti oleh penutup. Dan jangan lupa kita juga akan mengadakan polling di akhir acara ini, dan kami harap Bapak dan Ibu dapat berpartisipasi dalam polling tersebut. Sebelum kita mulai, saya ingin ingatkan kepada peserta sekalian, bagi Anda yang memiliki pertanyaan, silahkan tulis pertanyaan Anda di kolom Q&A selama acara berlangsung. Kami akan coba jawab pertanyaan tersebut baik secara tertulis, dan jika waktu memungkinkan akan kami jawab secara live. Anda juga dipersilahkan untuk menuliskan pertanyaan Anda dalam bahasa Indonesia. Langsung saja kita masuki materi pertama, yaitu ringkasan mengenai TCFD yang akan dibawakan oleh rekan saya, Fredrik Anderson. Sedikit perkenalan mengenai Fred. Saat ini beliau memimpin implementasi program perusahaan dan rantai pasok di kawasan Hong Kong, Asia Tenggara, Australia, dan Selandia Baru. Without further ado, I will pass the session to Fred. Please, Fred, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rini. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Yeah, as Rini said, my name is Fred. I work with CDP in Southeast Asia in particular. So I know many of you on the call joined our beginner workshop, but we do have quite a few new joiners today as well. So I will just spend about 10 minutes to do a summary of what we learned a couple of weeks back in the beginner workshop. And yeah, also just as a side note, apologies that my camera is not working today. My internet is not so fast where I am, so but hopefully you can hear me okay. If there are any issues, please do let me know. So before I get into to a recap, I also like to share some brief background on CDP. So we are a platform and a framework for companies to report environmental data. So what we do is to reach out to companies on behalf of our investor signatories, who are around 600 institutional investors who would like to better understand the environmental performance of listed companies. And in addition to our investor signatories, we also reach out to suppliers on behalf of large purchasing organizations who want to better understand the environmental risks, impacts, and performance within their supply chains. So on behalf of these stakeholders, we reach out to companies to collect environmental data through our online questionnaire. And the benefit of this is that our investors can access the data from a centralized location, and importantly, in a standardized and comparable manner for their investment decision-making. And especially relevant for today's session is that our climate questionnaire is fully aligned with the TCFD recommendations. Next slide, please, Rini. Thank you. So to understand the origins of the TCFD, we need to go back to 2015, when the Paris Agreement was adopted by nearly 200 nations. The focus of the agreement was, and still is, to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to pre-industrial levels. And so to achieve this goal, countries commit to taking action through what is known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And when a country provides its NDC goals, it specifies the actions it will take to reduce its emissions. And it also provides action plans to develop resilience to climate change. And the effects of climate change are already being felt globally, and it is now impacting some countries much more than others. This slide shows the latest assessment on 2021 Climate Economic Index from Swiss Re, one of the world's leading providers of insurance and other forms of insurance-based risk transfer. The Climate Economics Index stress tests how climate risks will impact 48 countries, representing 90% of the world's economy, and then ranks their overall climate resilience. It found that all countries will be affected, but some are more vulnerable than others. And as you can see from the slide, Indonesia, together with India, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines, are countries that have the highest climate vulnerability in the world, according to this test. And already located in the hot regions, the gradually rising temperature and more extreme weather events may deal a hard blow on GDP growth potential, including productivity impacts on agriculture, manufacturing, and the tourism service industries that these countries heavily rely on. So that's one of the changes that we have seen in recent years. And with this trend, companies operating and investing in Asian cities and companies are also going to face an increasingly stiff test to their resilience. So we risk Maplecroft, which is a risk analysis and data modeling company, also ranks about 600 of the world's largest urban centers on their exposure to a range of environmental and climate-related threats. And the assessment revealed that Jakarta was the most exposed to such risks. But across the globe, 414 cities with over 1.4 billion inhabitants are deemed to be at high or extreme risk from a combination of pollution, dwindling water supplies, extreme heat stress, natural hazards, and other types of vulnerability to climate change. And several Indonesian cities, such as Surabaya and Bandung, are also listed in 4th and 8th place, respectively, as the cities most threatened by these environmental risks. So to combat climate change and to successfully transition to a low carbon economy, more than 70 countries are currently working to establish policies to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And of these, 2 of the countries have already achieved carbon neutrality, and 6 more countries have incorporated net zero emissions into their legislation. So there is a lot of momentum going on the global policy level. And so how does the TCFD fit into all of this? After the Paris Agreement was established, finance ministers from the G20 countries asked the Financial Stability Board, or FSB, to review how climate risks were priced and accounted for in capital markets, with the goal of better understanding climate-related risks to the stability of the global financial system. In short, the FSB found that companies are under-reporting climate-related risks and that the capital markets lack the necessary information to understand and manage the uncertainties associated with climate change. And so to address this gap, the FSB created the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, as we now refer to as the TCFD, in order to identify the information needed by investors, lenders, and insurance underwriters to appropriately assess and price climate-related risks and opportunities. In practical terms, this meant developing a set of global guidelines for reporting on corporate environmental issues. And so the task force comprised representatives from corporations, auditors, insurers, banks, and other key players in the capital markets. And by 2017, they had produced the TCFD recommendations, which are 11 recommended disclosures under 4 different categories, namely governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And on the next slide, here you can see those 11 recommended disclosures that the TCFD came up with under each of the 4 pillars. So you can see the 4 categories horizontally in the columns, and then the corresponding recommendations vertically in the rows. And as you can see, there are 2 recommendations under the governance pillar on the left, and for the strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets pillars, there are 3 recommendations each. And companies who are able to report accurately and comprehensively against these 11 recommendations will align with the current global best practice and take steps to meet the expectations of the global investor community when it comes to corporate environmental disclosure. The issue is that these recommendations are still somewhat up for interpretations, and many companies still struggle to determine exactly what to report under each of these recommendations. And this is where CDP also may come in and help. So CDP takes the 11 recommendations and turn them into specific questions with clear guidance and assessment criteria. In other words, the TCFD recommendations provides guidelines for what investors want to know, and then CDP's online questionnaire break down those guidelines into actionable metrics. This means that CDP provides an ideal roadmap for companies looking to disclose on environmental issues in alignment with these TCFD recommendations. So if you're interested in learning the practical steps on this and how to report in alignment with the TCFD recommendations through CDP, please do review the beginner workshop. The recording is available. If you haven't received it, we are happy to share it with you. So just let us know if you are missing it. And today's topic and training is directly linked to the TCFD recommendations, and we are very lucky to be joined by an expert speaker to share more information on this. And on the strategy level, the TCFD stated in their report that, and I quote, "Given the importance of forward-looking assessments of climate-related risks, the TCFD believes that scenario analysis is an important and useful tool for an organization to use, both for assessing potential business implications of climate-related risks and opportunities, and also for informing stakeholders about how the organization is positioning itself in light of these risks and opportunities," end quote. And then, of course, on the risk level, the information that the TCFD recommend that you disclose on requires you to have undertaken climate risk assessments. And these are the 2 topics that we will look more closely at today. And so to do so, I will hand it back to my colleague Rini to introduce our next speaker. So back to you, please, Rini. Thanks.
Thank you, Fred, for the presentation. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, tadi Fred sudah memberikan rangkuman mengenai dasar-dasar TCFD dan juga konsep-konsepnya yang sudah diberikan di Lokakarya di awal Juni lalu. Semoga informasi tersebut dapat menyegarkan ingatan kita mengenai konsep dan kerangka TCFD. Selanjutnya, hari ini beruntung sekali kita kedatangan pemateri yang telah memiliki banyak pengalaman dalam 2 komponen penting dari TCFD, yaitu asesmen risiko dan skenario analisis perubahan iklim. Pemateri kita hari ini yaitu Ibu Lau Xinyi dari Carbon Trust. Ibu Xinyi saat ini memimpin program keuangan hijau atau Green Finance untuk Asia Tenggara. Saat ini Ibu Xinyi berlokasi atau bermarkas di Singapura. Dalam kesehariannya, beliau banyak bekerja dengan institusi keuangan dan perusahaan dalam berbagai proyek keuangan hijau dan berkelanjutan, yang meliputi berbagai instrumen keuangan dan juga penyediaan peningkatan kapasitas. Proyek terbaru yang beliau lakukan yaitu mengelola dan mengimplementasikan seri Lokakarya untuk risiko perubahan iklim untuk regulator keuangan dan bank-bank di Taiwan. Without further ado, please welcome Ibu Lau Xinyi. Xinyi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Rini. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Ibu.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, hi IDX colleagues, Ibu Rini, Fred, and all the participants. I'm Rini. I'm the Green Finance Lead of Southeast Asia at Carbon Trust, and I'm based in Singapore. My role involves delivering and expanding our green finance services in the region. I'm grateful to the organizers and the partners for inviting me to deliver this webinar today. And I would like to begin with a brief introduction to the Carbon Trust. In the next slide, please. The Carbon Trust is a not-for-dividend sustainability consultancy with the mission to accelerate the move to a sustainable, low-carbon economy. We are headquartered in London with a global team of more than 200 employees. Our team of experts work with businesses and organizations across the globe with offices in the UK, China, Singapore, Amsterdam, Mexico, and South Africa. Next slide, please. We partner with businesses, organizations, and governments around the world to help them lead the way to a more sustainable future, from setting the strategic direction, footprinting, and target setting, to energy systems and climate action plans. We support our clients to navigate the risk and opportunities of climate change. Next slide, please. Our webinar today takes us on a deep dive on the topic of climate-related risk management, where we will walk through the background followed by the risk management sections as found in the Tcfd Recommendations, as well as the Climate Financial Risk Forum Guide 2020. There will be time for participants to raise questions towards the end of this session. Before we start diving into climate risk, I think it is useful to briefly remind ourselves why we are talking about it. We as humans are estimated to have caused about 1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels. 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees is scientifically acknowledged as the maximum temperature rise that can take place before the effects become dangerous, even catastrophic. In the absence of policies, global warming is expected to reach 4.1 degrees to 4.8 degrees above pre-industrial by the end of the century. If we consider current policies in place around the world, this is projected to result in about 2.9 degrees of warming. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2100 means we must peak by 2020, we must reduce by 45% by 2030, and we must achieve net zero emissions by 2050. It is worth mentioning that half a degree beyond 1.5 degrees will significantly worsen the risk of biodiversity loss, drought, floods, extreme heat, and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. Let's put this into context. With the impact of COVID last year, the level of emissions are set to fall by 8% in 2020 as a result of the pandemic, but that is not enough. Global emissions will need to reduce by 7.6% every year this decade to limit warming to less than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The next slide. We therefore know that climate risk can only increase from this point on. We know it is happening, it is foreseeable, and it is systematic. How do we define climate risk? It is typically split into two categories. First, physical risks that arise from the impact of extreme climatic events such as hurricanes or floods, or the impact of rising sea levels, loss of ecosystem services such as desertification, water shortage, degradation of soil quality, or marine ecology. Second, transition risks that arise from efforts to address climate change, including changes in public policies, technology breakthroughs, shifts in investors or public sentiments. Examples are carbon tax, EV technology, sentiment towards plastic, and investment in coal. As shown on this slide, the risks interact and how they will materialize depends on actions of consumers, corporates, and governments, as well as the advances of technology. With complete failure to act, we will see physical risks dominate, a complete climate breakdown, as well as large environmental and economic impact. A fully orderly transition is unlikely, But if we reach Paris, we will probably get considerable transition risk materializing, but with less extreme physical risk. If we see a very late but large shift on policy, we can see high transition risk materialize. Next, let's now briefly talk through how climate risk transmits into financial risk. When we think about financial risk, we think about credit risk, liquidity risk, market risk, underwriting risk, and operational risk. How does climate risk, transition, and physical translate into financial risk? With transition risk, firms can see their earnings decline, businesses disrupted, and funding costs increase because of policy action, technological change, and consumer and investor demands for changing. That means impact on the market, credit, and liquidity risk. The share prices of coal mining companies already reflect this carbon discount as well as higher financing costs. Households can also be affected as their jobs might shift or assets become stranded. That means credit and market risk. Physical risk can materialize directly through exposures to firms and households that experience climate shocks like flooding and forest fires that leads to increased default risk of loan portfolios or lower values of assets. For example, rising sea levels and a higher incidence of extreme weather events can cause losses for homeowners and diminish property values, leading to greater risk in mortgage portfolios. Corporate credit portfolios are also at risk, as highlighted by the bankruptcy of California's largest utility, Pacific Gas and Electric. With climate changes causing prolonged droughts in California, this increased the risk of fires from their operations. Tighter credit conditions might follow, in particular when climate shocks affect many institutions simultaneously, causing a feedback loop. Next, efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change also brings about opportunities. These climate-related opportunities will vary depending on the region, market, and industry in which an organization operates. This slide captures examples of what climate-related opportunities look like. On resource efficiency, there is growing evidence and examples of organizations that have successfully reduced operating costs by improving efficiency in their business activities, in particular in relation to energy efficiency, but also including broader materials, water, and waste management. Innovation in technology is assisting this transition, for example, retrofitting buildings and developing electric vehicles. Resource efficiency could also be seen in increased production capacity, resulting in increased revenues. Next, investments in renewable energy capacity have exceeded investments in fossil fuel generation. Organizations that shift their energy usage towards low emission energy sources could potentially save on annual energy costs. This also reduces exposure to greenhouse gas emissions and makes the organization less sensitive to changes in cost of carbon. On products and services, organizations that innovate and develop new low-emission products and services may improve their competitive position and capitalize on shifting consumer and producer preferences. These include consumer goods and services that emphasize the product's carbon footprint in its marketing and labeling, as well as producer goods that focus on reducing emissions. And then organizations that proactively seek opportunities in new markets or types of assets may be able to diversify their activities and better position themselves for the transition to a lower carbon economy. New opportunities can also be captured through underwriting or financing green bonds and infrastructure. And finally, climate resilience involves organizations developing the adaptive capacity to respond to climate change to better manage the associated risk and seize opportunities. These may be especially relevant for those with long-lived fixed assets or extensive supply or distribution networks. A climate resilient organization will benefit from increased reliability of supply chain and ability to operate under various conditions. We now move to a poll question for the participants. On this slide, the question is, which of the following shapes climate change related risk and opportunities for an organization? You may refer to the poll function and choose the options that apply. Okay, I see most of us have put in our responses. As I'm looking at the poll results, we are seeing the highest percentage choosing regulations and carbon price, which is the correct answer. There are also a number who have chosen technology breakthroughs, consumer behavior shifts, as well as physical impacts of climate. So this is quite positive, and the answers are indeed those options. Let me take you through the explanations behind these options. If I can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So on this slide, we see the rationale behind the four options. The first option on regulatory requirements that are related to climate change, for example, carbon tax, makes it more costly for carbon-intensive sectors to operate in the future. The second is on technological breakthroughs, which will affect the competitiveness of certain organizations, their production and distribution costs, and ultimately the demand for their products and services from end users. On consumer behavior, the shifts could lead to high demand for products which are sustainably sourced or produced. And in the last option, increased severity of extreme weather events could affect organizations' premises, operations, supply chain, transport needs, and employee safety. With this context in mind, we would dive into the TCFD recommendations and share Carbon Trust's experience of meeting these recommendations in practice. In the next slide, the framework laid out in the recommendations is split into four core areas of governance: strategy, risk management, as well as metrics and targets. The first is governance, looking at the role of senior leadership in understanding, engaging around climate, as well as being accountable. Second, having taken responsibility, is the ability of the business to scan the horizon, translate the external pressures of the climate into internal decision making, and identify impacts before they manifest, thus developing the strategy. This is also a key step to understanding climate-related opportunities for the business. Third is having identified the risk, your risk management process for managing risk and minimizing the negative outcomes. Fourth is how your knowledge of potential risk and opportunities is translated into means of tracking and reporting with suitable metrics and targets in a way that is accessible to your stakeholders. In considering your response to any of these areas, it is important to focus on how your approach relates to the financial outcomes. If we can move to the next slide, please. The four overarching recommendations are supported by key climate-related financial disclosures, referred to as recommended disclosures, that build up the framework with information that will help investors and others understand how reporting organizations think about and assess climate-related risk and opportunities. The risk management pillar is aimed at evaluating an organization's overall risk profile and risk management activities. To do so, we need to understand how an organization's climate-related risks are identified, assessed, and managed, and whether those steps are integrated into existing risk management processes. The recommended disclosure is categorized into three parts. Part A involves describing the organization's processes for identifying and assessing climate-related risks. This means that organizations should explain their approach to determining the relative significance of climate-related risk and the factors considered, such as existing and emerging regulatory requirements. Doing so enables the organization to communicate the breadth of factors considered, both in terms of different risk factors, but also whether the full value chain is included. It is also important to report the steps taken to assess the potential size and scope of identified climate-related risk, alongside the definitions of risk terminology or references to current risk classification frameworks used. Moving from identifying and assessing, Part B concerns the organization's processes for managing climate-related risk. These include how organizations make decisions to mitigate, transfer, accept, or control those risks. Organizations should also describe their processes for prioritizing climate-related risks. Part C then looks at how the steps for identifying, assessing, and managing climate-related risk are integrated into the firm's overall risk management. There are three ways to treat climate risk, which are first, as a standalone risk type, second, a cross-cutting risk, or third, both cross-cutting risk and as a standalone risk. If climate risk is seen as a standalone risk type, then the necessary frameworks and policies need to be developed accordingly. In the case of a cross-cutting risk type, organizations can consider implementing a work plan to progressively update the relevant risk type frameworks and policies, prioritizing as necessary based on relevance, materiality, and resourcing. Next, to produce reporting that is aligned to the TCFD recommendations, we now turn our focus to the process. Our approach to TCFD projects is based on the idea that the risk evaluation process has to be cost efficient. This means that we focus on what is material and critical to decision making and avoid getting lost in the detail. The figure on this slide illustrates the practical steps a company can take to set the foundation for a TCFD aligned disclosure. Next, it is probably helpful to break down the practical steps into a series of actions that build upon each other. The first step is to identify risk and opportunities. We recommend organizations to compile a long list of climate-related risk and opportunities relevant to the organization, such as the specific company characteristics and the industry in which it operates. This is achieved through desk-based research, data analysis, and workshops or interviews with relevant stakeholders. We would like to ensure that a holistic and comprehensive review of potential risks and opportunities is taken to avoid focusing on the obvious or easy things. This is achieved by classifying the risk and opportunities on predefined categories to identify trends and hotspots. Categories can be related to the drivers of risk and opportunities, such as the relevant TCFD category, their root cause, and the time horizon over which they can occur, and to the impact that they have on the company, such as the value chain stage, financial value driver, and market or geography. The second step entails prioritizing risk and opportunities using scenarios. This is by assigning scenario-driven parameters and financial metrics to the risk and opportunities. Parameters are scenario data that can be used to represent the risk driver, such as temperatures and weather patterns or carbon pricing projections across scenarios. Financial metrics are company-specific financial indicators that are affected by each risk or opportunity, such as specific cost items or revenue streams. This is very important and valuable to understand what happens to the organization, not just what is happening to the market, economy, and society. Climate risk necessarily increases, so considering multiple scenarios is valuable instead of assuming a business as usual or what we call a BAU scenario. We build on the previous step by scoring and prioritizing risk and opportunities against detailed criteria. The data collected on scenario-driven parameters and financial metrics can be translated into comparable outputs, which can in turn be used to assess the most substantial risk and opportunities and compile a short list. For the third step, we quantify the financial impact by calculating the value at stake. This enables us to understand the cumulative loss or value creation between the business as usual BAU scenario and the analyzed climate scenarios. The BAU scenario refers to a scenario for future patterns of activity, which assumes that there will be no significant change in people's attitudes and priorities, or no major changes in technology, economics, or policies, so that normal circumstances can be expected to continue unchanged. The fourth step pertains to identifying responses to manage outcomes of the risk and opportunities. This includes analyzing results to identify appropriate managerial responses in order to mitigate risk and capitalize on the opportunities. In the next slide, we'll just examine the TCFD recommendations, focusing on guidance applicable to all sectors. As companies step up their climate-related financial disclosures, it is essential that such information is likewise incorporated into decision-making processes of the financial sector, and we will consider the Climate Financial Risk Forum Guide 2020, specifically the Risk Management chapter. This chapter represents the output from the cross-industry Risk Management Working Group of the UK's Prudential Regulation Authority and Financial Conduct Authority's Climate Financial Risk Forum. The document contains information on approaches to managing the risk associated with climate change and views on good practices at the time of production. The guide is aimed at banks, asset managers, and insurers of all sizes. The guide is split into the following topics, which were considered the most relevant for climate risk management. This webinar will focus on the first 4 topics indicated with the red asterisk. To facilitate our understanding, I have structured the content around 3 phases: define, implement, and achieve where relevant. Let's go through each phase in more detail. Effective governance should ensure that there is understanding, oversight, and accountability for financial risk arising from climate change, collectively termed as climate risk, at all levels of an institution. The board has ultimate responsibility and accountability for the long-term health and resilience of a firm. As is the case with established financial and non-financial risk, the board's understanding and oversight of the firm's approach to management of climate risk is key to embedding effective governance. The next slide provides a suggested approach to establishing board governance. Firstly, deliver a tailored training program to the board on climate risk and consider using external experts when needed. Second, update the board committee terms of reference to include climate risk. Third, provide periodic regular updates to relevant board committees on the firm's progress in preparing for and implementing climate risk management, as well as the risk reporting matrix, for example, the risk appetite and the matrix that are developed accordingly. Fourthly, the board is to provide review and challenge on undue or unexpected climate risk concentrations on the firm's strategy or corporate plan, considering the climate risk profile through a short, medium, and long-term lens, materiality assessments and scenario analysis by climate outcomes and time horizons, as well as the emerging regulatory, reputational, and legal obligations. The ultimate goal for firms is to design and implement the governance approach for climate risk, akin to establish financial risk while addressing the climate risk-specific nuances where necessary. One potential indicator of the firm's quality of climate risk governance could be based on the extent to which climate risk management is integrated effectively into established risk management. This slide captures elements of good practice such as effective management and oversight from the board, appropriate allocation of senior management responsibility, as well as clear roles, responsibilities, and accountability across all three lines of defense. To further illustrate the roles and responsibilities, the first line of defense focuses on client engagement and assessing their climate risk. The second line of defense establishes the framework, the tools, and delivers the climate risk training. The third line of defense reviews the control design and execution. We move to our next topic, which is risk management frameworks. Risk management frameworks are a key means to operationalize risk governance. In the case of climate risk, this should be integrated into existing enterprise risk management frameworks strategically and in line with board-level risk appetite. As described earlier, there are three ways to approach climate risk and develop risk management frameworks by treating climate risk as first, a standalone risk type, a cross-cutting risk, or both cross-cutting risk and a standalone risk. Firms can determine which is the best approach by undertaking a materiality assessment of climate risk. Let's illustrate this process using a diagram on the next slide. Can we have the next slide, please? Can I check if you can see the slides?
Yeah. Hi, Rini. I think we
No,
lost the slide from the
Rini,
screen.
do you want to share? Just a moment.
Yeah, sorry.
We are
I
waiting
have some
for
issues.
Rini. I think she has some.
Yeah. Hi, Shindy. Can you hear me? I think I have some issue with my internet. Give me a
Okay.
moment. I'll share my screen.
Yeah.
No problem.
Shindy, hopefully you can see the screen. Which slide was it on?
It was the diagram, slide, the diagram with the slider diagram, sorry. Yes, slide with the diagram.
This one?
No, we are still at risk management framework, which is before this.
Oh, before. This one.
That's right, this is the diagram, thank you.
Yeah.
Right, so at the top of the diagram, the company performs a materiality assessment. The factors to consider in the materiality assessment include the firm's exposure to physical and transition risk. Exposure could be associated with both the firm's own property and its business model, including concentrations of risk at portfolio and transaction level and by geographical footprint. The firm then identifies the risk types which are impacted by climate change and decides whether to handle climate risk as a standalone or a cross-cutting risk type. This in turn informs the frameworks and the policies needed. What constitutes good practice for climate risk framework? The guide lists the following elements, such as treating climate risk as a cross-cutting risk type that manifests through most of the established standalone risk types. Whether treated as a principal risk or a cross-cutting risk type, linkages of climate risk with established risk types should be established and understood in the company. There should also be tools to identify and evaluate physical and transition risk, and to set up a uniform risk taxonomy and risk categories both for individual clients and transactions and at an aggregate portfolio level. This is done with a view to assess risk concentrations. In defining the firm's appetite for adopting good practice or the extent to which the firm chooses to adopt good practice, consideration should be given to the cost and resourcing needs. The next topic we want to consider is risk appetite. Risk appetite should reflect and communicate the level of climate financial risk that an organization is willing to take, and these needs to be appropriate to the business model. A firm's risk appetite may incorporate broader considerations based on environmental, social, and governance, or what we call ESG, reputational risk, or corporate responsibility, such as a no harm approach, which may already exist within the organization. Having a climate risk appetite can enable institutions to initiate preemptive risk monitoring and mitigation. For example, business model decisions to avoid concentration of exposure in sectors likely to be affected by climate risk. Metrics in the form of quantitative or qualitative measures are important to allow the business and risk committees to monitor the risk profile. In the case where climate risk is a standalone risk category, the risk appetite should also have a clear, plain English statement which expresses the firm's acceptable risk level. As the ability to monitor climate risk becomes more sophisticated, institutions should begin to develop a series of metrics. The risk management chapter provides different examples of quantitative metrics. This slide focuses on two of such metrics which were chosen for illustration purposes. For example, the matrix related to monitoring serves to alert management to potential change, which could mean that risk appetite may be breached. In practice, this could mean putting a percentage limit on exposures or investments in high transition risk industries. Some initial steps to define a climate risk appetite involves firstly thinking about business strategies, the existing portfolio, and the type of climate risk faced. As an example, the banking sector may be more vulnerable to transition risk if they are providing long-term loans to clients that may be affected by climate policy. Secondly, engaging the board to probe specific aspects of risk appetite, and the risk management chapter contains a list of potential board questions to gauge their tolerance for climate risk. Thirdly, developing and approving a qualitative statement. This is followed by identifying the matrix and associated set of thresholds which allow clear monitoring through a red, amber, green status or similar, and provide an early warning system which can prompt action as required. In the longer term, it is important to assess how matrix can best include the results from scenario analysis and impact assessments or trend analysis such as weather-related catastrophe losses over the years. Climate-related risks manifesting through transition and physical channels are considered as systemic risk, which could impact the stability of the financial system. Risk assessment of the financial risk as well as the non-financial risk is essential to measure, monitor, and mitigate the risk within a firm's appetite. Scenario analysis is a key risk and business analysis tool to assess the impact of climate change, especially given the underlying uncertainties in how and when risk will manifest. More details on scenario analysis will be examined in the next part of our workshop. The diagram illustrates the financial risk impacted by climate risk. In this section, we will focus on 4 risk categories on the right-hand side, which are insurance underwriting risk, credit risk, financial market risk, and operational risk. These risks are considered by the Risk Management Working Group to be the most material and applicable across the financial sector. On this slide, we define the 4 types of climate-related financial risk. In the case of insurance underwriting risk, increased climate-related litigation activity against fossil fuel companies and other greenhouse gas emitters carry financial implications. Insurance losses can be associated with valuation of the liabilities and pricing, particularly affecting first, general liability and directors and officers cover due to climate-related litigations, and second, credit and surety cover related to stranded assets. On the credit risk side, credit risk analysis would consider climate impact upon all P&L, cash flow, and balance sheet metrics. Risk due diligence increasingly incorporates a qualitative assessment of the client's board's understanding, commitment, and communication on the issue. In the context of climate change, financial market risk is defined in the following context. First, the market value, or what we call the MV, loss due to societal, legal, and technological response to climate change, particularly affecting bonds and loans, commodities, and equities. Or the MV loss due to concern over actual climate or weather events. Physical risk will particularly affect property, real estate, and commodities, but can also impact corporates more broadly, such as the impact of rising temperatures or loss of water supply on production facilities. In addition, operational risk can materialize, for instance, when increasing frequency and severity of weather events affect the operations of financial institutions. This slide captures the steps to implement climate change risk management effectively, targeting the different financial risks. Under insurance underwriting risk, we outline 4 steps, which are research on climate change. So firms need to define which information is relevant for them based on their exposures and assess the relevant research channels. To define an adequate risk appetite, which is the next step, it is important to have clarity around the materiality of climate change factors and relevant time horizons. Firms may leverage existing risk management processes and tools for the assessment of climate change risk, and also to establish a risk mitigation plan. This will enable firms to stay within risk appetite under a forward-looking perspective. Depending on the business model, a long-term perspective, for example, up to 10 to 30 years may be adopted. As with all risks, primary responsibility to address credit risk should lie with the first line of defense, with risk being second line. Formal training is needed to educate both lines of defense regarding terminology, matrix, and bank policy. First line of defense should also be responsible for engagement with clients that appear to be lagging. Sustainability needs to be built into all client discussions and be used to inform consideration of both risk and opportunities. The bank should maintain a monitoring or exclusion list for non-compliant corporates. In the case of financial market risk, implementation will vary depending on a firm's risk systems and organization. In the short term, leading practice calls for the use of tools and systems to incorporate climate risk as part of qualitative sector and company analysis and fiscal real asset evaluation. Portfolio monitoring and climate reporting is prevalent, and in certain asset classes, reinforcing climate risk with stewardship and voting practices is possible today. In the medium term, scenarios will evolve to include risk appetite limits within climate financial risk management, the management of operational risk arising from climate change, whether from physical or transition risk, should be fully incorporated and mapped into the operational risk management cycle. Examples of near-term steps to manage operational risk include developing and implementing where appropriate risk appetite statements, operational limits, and triggers setting out the operational risk the company is willing to bear. Exposures against these limits can then be monitored and reported to on an ongoing basis. Recording or categorizing any climate-related operational losses or events and include losses or events in BAU risk reporting. Incremental updates to management information are likely to be required as sophistication, capabilities, and data increase. As we come to the end of this segment on risk management, here is a summary of what we covered today. Climate risk can be categorized as physical risk and transition risk, and both of them carry financial impacts. Those who proactively take steps to mitigate and adapt to climate change can also reap opportunities such as resource efficiency, a more diversified market, as well as climate resilient supply chain. These can generate financial benefits. Risk management is one of the core areas in the Tcfd recommendations, and our webinar today examines the steps which can be taken to implement risk management across all sectors, as well as the recommended disclosures. It is important that the risk evaluation process is cost efficient. The principle is to focus on what is material and critical to decision making and avoid getting lost in the detail. Another source of information is the Climate Financial Risk Forum Guide 2020, specifically the risk management chapter, which is aimed at banks, asset managers, and insurers of all sizes. Our webinar focused on 4 topics within that chapter, namely risk governance, risk management frameworks, risk appetite, as well as risk assessment. Some of the information may be more relevant for different firms. However, the evolving environment and commercial realities have heightened the urgency for corporates and financial institutions to develop an understanding of their vulnerabilities and assess the strategic and business opportunities. And this brings me to the end of the first part of our workshop, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Rini. I'm not sure if you are managed to connect again.
Yes, Fred, I managed to connect. And
Great,
Cindy,
great.
apologies for the glitch just now. Suddenly I lost my internet. Yes, and Fred, thank you very much. And since you're here, actually, thank you very much, Cindy, for the insightful presentation on climate risk assessment. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, sekarang kita akan masuki sesi tanya-jawab. Yang pertama pada hari ini, tadi sudah ada beberapa pertanyaan yang masuk dan sudah dijawab oleh rekan saya, Fred. Saya juga akan undang rekan saya Fred untuk memoderasi sesi tanya-jawab ini. Jadi bagi Bapak dan Ibu sekalian yang masih memiliki pertanyaan tapi belum menuliskannya di kotak Q&A, mohon untuk tuliskan pertanyaan Anda di kotak Q&A. Tadi pertanyaannya sudah beberapa dijawab oleh Fred. I know, Fred, you've answered several questions, but we do have one question that's still unanswered, which is in Bahasa Indonesia. I will try to translate the question, but it's really focused in Indonesia. So let me know if this is something that beyond your scope. Also to Sini, just in case you know the answer. So the question would be. Previously, there is some question about the carbon trading, and the question would be how far the collaboration between NGOs and the feedback or action that has been conducted or implemented by the Indonesian government regarding the carbon trading. So let me know, Cindy, if you have any insight regarding carbon trading in Indonesia, or Fred, or otherwise we can come back with the answer to this question later offline. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Rini. So CDP has done quite a lot of research on carbon pricing in recent years in particular. And a few months ago in April, we released a new report where we looked at the carbon pricing mechanisms in place globally. And we are also looking at what companies are doing and what are the emerging best practice in carbon pricing management, both on a policy level and also on a corporate level. I don't have any insights specifically on the status in Indonesia. I would be very happy to look into it. We have quite a lot of information that we can look for and follow up with you after the event. And if there are any other questions, do feel free to put them in the Q&A or in the chat. And I think let's wait one more minute and see if we get any more questions. So while we wait, after the Q&A, we have time for a short break until 10:30 a.m. Jakarta time. So in 18 minutes, we will restart the program for the second half of the workshop, where Rini will provide more information about climate-related scenario analysis.
Mungkin
So,
bahasannya tadi,
go ahead, Rini,
ya,
please.
mungkin bahasannya tadi lumayan cukup teknis. Bapak dan Ibu mungkin masih mencerna pertanyaan apa yang dari presentasi Ibu Rini tadi, apa saja yang hal-hal apa saja yang masih belum jelas dan mungkin masih ingin ditanyakan, dan bagaimana mengimplementasikan analisis risiko tersebut dalam konteks perusahaan Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. Nah, kami masih tunggu pertanyaan Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. Mohon menjawab mohon menuliskan pertanyaan Anda di kolom kotak Q&A, dan good thing ada beberapa pertanyaan yang masuk. There's a few questions in me that came into the Q&A box. So, and Fred, so the next question would be, in financing company, we have 8 risks to mitigate, which are strategic, operational, credit, market, liquidity, law, compliance, and reputation. How to implement climate risk assessments embedded in each risk, or adding one risk, which is climate change?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I'm happy to share a little bit information from CDP's perspective, and then Rini, I'll hand it over to you to see if you have anything to supplement. But when CDP collects environmental data on climate risks, we ask companies to break them into the different categories, as you say. So, for example, when we receive information about climate risks, we want to see, is this a reputational risk? Is it related to compliance, operational, market, and so forth? So when you have your climate risk assessment, it should, or it could be integrated into your overall enterprise risk management process, your ERM system, but it should be comprehensive enough to be able to identify individual risks within these different categories. So yeah, Rini, anything that you would like to add to that?
Thank you so much, Fred. I think where I would add is more in terms of going back to the basics, what do you see as your exposures? And that's when we will have to do a materiality assessment to understand the nature of this business, what are the types of financing arrangements, what's the time horizon we consider, so on and so forth. So I think with all these different dimensions, that's when we will be able to understand how are the risks, climate risks going to interact with the 8 risks that you have identified, and what kind of time horizons are we looking at. Maybe climate risk may not manifest in the short term, but maybe more of a medium or long term. And so depending on the way risk is currently being managed, would it make more sense to have it as a standalone risk, or maybe a cross-cutting risk, but putting a caveat that this is only in a medium term or the long term. So it really depends on the case-by-case basis, depending on how you're currently managing climate risk. How are you analyzing this risk? Is it by geography? Is it by time horizon? So on and so forth.
Thank you, Rini. And Rini, one more follow-up question. So the example in scenario analysis was applied to financial services. Can we use the same approach or reference to different business categories or sectors? So yeah, I know that in the second part of the workshop today, where we will go more, or Rini will go more into climate related scenario analysis, we will also have some examples from different industries, chemicals, I believe. Is that right, Rini?
That's right. Yes, that's right. So I think where the question is coming from is really in terms of the different stages and the processes. So the approach that we have shared through the CFRF guide are still relevant and useful for both financial and non-financial players. So for example, risk governance, risk management frameworks, risk appetite, scenario identification and development. It is the nature of the risk to a non-financial company that will be very different to the nature of the risk to a financial company. So we are talking about is this company then facing a more direct exposure to the risk, or are they seeing the transmission of the risk through the financial instrument? So that's the difference.
Thank you, Rini. And we have a few more questions. We also have a Q&A later in the event, but we'll take one more question before we go on a 10-minute break. So Rini, how can companies judge or validate the results of climate risk scenarios? Or is this something that you would like that we will address in the second half as well?
So the whole purpose of scenario analysis is to determine among the long list of climate risks and opportunities we've identified, how do we know which is the most important? And so this is where you would have to come up with certain criteria. And as you can break them down into things like the financial matrix as a parameter, or it could be things like value drivers. So it really, as I say, is a bit more of a case-by-case basis. And through the whole process of scenario analysis, as we come out with some of these parameters, as we do some scoring against them, that's when we will be able to guide us towards understanding what is their financial impact. And I will demonstrate this through the work example in our next part of the workshop.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rini. And also maybe one thing to add there is, also in climate-related scenario analysis, we often see companies conduct multiple scenarios. So it will also give them, a range where you can look at an, upper or lower boundaries and understand kind of the range that the company would fall within. But yeah, as Rini said, we will have more in-depth information about climate-related scenario analysis after the break. Now we have time for a 10 minutes break, so everyone can answer some emails or stretch your legs. So thank you very much for joining us so far, and we look forward to starting again in 10 minutes at 10:30 a.m. Thank you.
Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, waktu break kita sudah habis. Langsung saja kita akan masuki sesi kedua untuk pembahasan mengenai risiko analisis dan analisis skenario perubahan iklim. Dan saya lihat Cindy sudah siap dengan untuk presentasi berikutnya. Langsung saja saya persilahkan Cindy untuk memberikan paparannya. The floor is yours, Cindy.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Rini speaking.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So hi everyone, welcome to the second part of our webinar. In this second part of our webinar, we will focus on climate scenario analysis, beginning with an overview of this topic. Let's move to the agenda slide. So apart from the overview of this topic, we will unpack the relevant guidance from the Tcfd Recommendations and the CFRF guide. We will also consider a case study to help us apply what we have learned today. Participants will also have the opportunity to raise questions during the Q&A segment. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Scenario analysis is a process for identifying and assessing the potential implications of a range of possible future states under conditions of uncertainty. Scenarios are hypothetical constructs and not designed to deliver precise outcomes or forecasts. They provide a way for organizations to consider how the future might look if certain trends persist or certain conditions are met. In the case of climate change, its most significant effects are likely to emerge over the medium to longer term. Individual organizations find difficulty in understanding the potential effects of climate change due to the uncertain timing and magnitude of these impacts. Scenario analysis presents one way to help organizations consider how their climate-related risks and opportunities may evolve and the potential implications under different conditions. This in turn enables organizations to appropriately incorporate the potential effects in their planning processes. Scenario analysis can be qualitative, relying on descriptive written narratives, or quantitative, relying on numerical data and models, or some combination of both. Qualitative scenario analysis explores relationships and trends for which little or no numerical data is available. Quantitative scenario analysis can be used to assess measurable trends and relationships using models and other analytical techniques. Both rely on scenarios that are internally consistent, logical, and based on explicit assumptions and constraints that result in possible future development paths. Next slide, please. What are some reasons to consider using scenario analysis for climate change? First, scenario analysis can help organizations consider issues like climate change that have the following characteristics. Possible outcomes that are highly uncertain, for example, the physical response of the climate and ecosystems to high levels of GHG emissions in the atmosphere, outcomes that materialize over the medium to longer term, as well as potential disruptive effects that, due to uncertainty and complexity, are substantial. Secondly, scenario analysis can enhance organizations' strategic conversations about the future by considering in a structured manner what may unfold that is different from business as usual. Third, scenario analysis can help organizations frame and assess the potential range of possible business, strategic, and financial impacts from climate change and the associated management actions that may need to be considered in strategic and financial plans. These may result in more robust strategies under a wider range of uncertain future conditions. Fourthly, scenario analysis can help organizations identify the indicators to monitor the external environment and better recognize when the environment is moving towards a different scenario state or a different stage along a scenario path. Organizations can in turn reassess and adjust their strategies and financial plans. Finally, scenario analysis can assist investors in understanding the robustness of organization strategies and financial plans, and in comparing risk and opportunities across organizations. In the next slide, one of the task force key recommended disclosures focuses on the resilience of an organization's strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2 degrees or lower scenario. Disclosure of how an organization's strategies might change to address potential climate-related risk and opportunities is a key step to better understanding the potential implications of climate change on the organization. Let's take a closer look at the Tcfd recommendations and its guidance on scenario analysis. As you might recall, in the earlier part of our webinar, we learned that there are 2 major categories of climate-related risk, which are transition risk as well as physical risk. Exposure to climate-related risk varies across sectors, industries, and individual organizations. Transition risk scenarios are particularly relevant for resource-intensive organizations with high GHG emissions within their value chains, where policy actions, technology, or market changes aimed at emissions reductions, energy efficiency, subsidies or taxes, or other constraints or incentives may have a particularly direct effect. A key type of transition risk scenario is what we call a 2 degree scenario. Under the Paris Agreement, nearly 200 governments agreed to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. A 2 degree scenario provides a common reference point that is generally aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement and will support investors' evaluation of the potential magnitude and timing of transition-related implications for individual organizations, across different organizations within a sector, and across different sectors. A wide range of organizations are exposed to climate-related physical risk. Physical climate-related scenarios are particularly relevant for organizations exposed to acute or chronic climate change, such as those with long-lived fixed assets, locations or operations in climate-sensitive regions, for example, coastal and flood zones, reliance on availability of water. Physical risk scenarios generally identify extreme weather threats of moderate or higher risk before 2030 and a larger number and range of physical threats between 2030 and 2050. Organizations typically focus on the consequences of physical risk scenarios over shorter timeframes that reflect the lifetimes of their respective assets or liabilities, which vary across sectors and organizations. Although there are certain sectors with greater exposure, all sectors and parts of society will be exposed to risk. As a systemic risk factor, it is important for companies to consider what other sectors or infrastructure they are reliant on. The task force recognizes that organizations will be at different levels of experience in using scenario analysis. For organizations just beginning to use scenario analysis, a qualitative approach that progresses and deepens over time may be appropriate. For organizations with more extensive experience in conducting scenario analysis, greater rigor and sophistication in the use of data and quantitative models and analysis may be warranted. The choice of approach will depend on an organization's needs, resources, and capabilities. In conducting scenario analysis, organizations should strive to achieve first, transparency around the parameters, assumptions, analytical approaches, and timeframes. Also, the comparability of results across different scenarios and analytical approaches. adequate documentation for the methodology, assumptions, data sources, and analytics, consistency of methodology year over year, sound governance over scenario analysis, conduct, validation, approval, and application, and effective disclosure of the scenario analysis that will inform and promote a constructive dialogue between investors and organizations on the range of potential impacts and resilience of the organization's strategy under various possible climate-related scenarios. In applying scenario analysis, organizations should consider general implications for their strategies, capital allocation, and cost and revenue, both at an enterprise-wide level and the level of specific regions and markets where specific implications of climate change for the organization are likely to arise. Financial sector organizations should consider using scenario analysis to evaluate the potential impact of climate-related scenarios on individual assets or investments or assets in a particular sector or region, or underwriting activities. By using widely applied scenarios, organizations can achieve transparency and comparability of results. The TCFD recommends the use of temperature-based scenarios. These are comprehensive and holistic scenarios analyzing how the world might develop, the corresponding impacts that these pathways have on average global temperature and resultant climate change. There are a few types of scenarios. First, a smooth and orderly transition to a low carbon economy, which is associated with a global average temperature rise of 2 degrees or lower. Second, a lack of transition or transition based on known technology and policy developments. In other words, current policy scenarios, which result in higher temperature increases. Other scenarios move away from this dichotomy, and they describe a disorderly transition where stringent policies kick off at a later date to meet the climate commitments. The TCFD also recommends that organizations use a 2 degrees or lower scenario in addition to 2 or 3 other scenarios most relevant to their circumstances. For companies undertaking scenario analysis for the first time, it is advisable to initially consider a scenario which outlines an orderly transition to a low carbon economy, which will allow for analyzing transition risk, and another non-transition scenario, which will highlight physical risk. In practice, this means focusing on a scenario consistent with the Paris Agreement goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees, and another scenario aligned to current policies and pledges leading to approximately 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. More advanced companies that gain familiarity with scenario analysis should consider looking at extreme scenarios such as abrupt and disorderly transitions and the breach of climatic tipping points. This could include scenarios aligned to the highest ambition of the Paris Agreement of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, as well as no additional policy scenarios exceeding 4 degrees of warming. Besides the different temperature increases, scenarios also differ in the level of granularity offered, the sectorial focus taken, the driving data sets and assumptions, and the underlying narrative described. This means that companies can choose between a wide set of resources, and often scenario data comes from a variety of sources depending on the risk or opportunity in question. When selecting scenario data, companies should consider the general implications for strategy, capital investment, cost, and revenue, both at a company level and at the specific regional or market level, where specific impacts of climate change are likely to arise. To illustrate, we want to turn to a worked example for the oil and gas sector to quantify the financial impact for climate risk using detailed and bespoke modeling. The climate risk we consider is higher tax payable due to increased carbon tax rate. We begin by extracting the carbon price projections from climate scenario databases. Then we project the resulting impact on the financial metric. The financial metric is tax payable, and this step entails developing a specific calculation to calculate it. This could be Scope 1 emissions multiplied by the carbon price, where Scope 1 emissions are found in companies' environmental reports. The third stage involves calculating the value at stake. Value at stake is calculated as the difference in tax payable between a BAU or business as usual scenario where there is no carbon tax and the two climate scenarios. The disclosures of organizations' forward-looking assessments of climate-related issues is important for investors and other stakeholders in understanding how vulnerable individual organizations are to transition and physical risk, and how such vulnerabilities are or would be addressed. For an organization in the initial stages of implementing scenario analysis or with limited exposure to climate-related issues, the task force recommends disclosing how resilient, qualitatively or directionally, the organization's strategy and financial plans may be to a range of relevant climate change scenarios. Organizations with more significant exposure to climate-related issues should consider disclosing key assumptions and pathways related to the scenarios they use to allow users to understand the analytical process and its limitations. It is important to understand the critical parameters and assumptions that materially affect the conclusions drawn, and the task force recommends disclosing the following elements as shown on this slide. We have just examined the Tcfd recommendations focusing on guidance applicable to all sectors. Climate scenario analysis is also important to the financial sector, and we now turn to the CFRF Guide's Scenario Analysis chapter. This chapter represents the output from the cross-industry scenario analysis working group of the UK's Prudential Regulation Authority and Financial Conduct Authority's Climate Financial Risk Forum, or what we call CFRF. The document provides practical guidance on how to use scenario analysis to assess climate-related financial risk to inform the firm's strategy and business decisions. The guide is aimed at banks, asset managers, and insurers of all sizes. The chapter describes current industry good practices, but it is also designed to guide firms which have yet to fully consider this topic. As you have seen in the risk management chapter, a common approach is to perform a materiality assessment and initially focus on a small set of risks with scope and sophistication increasing over time. This approach holds true for scenario analysis, where it is sensible to start by identifying material exposures, considering simple what-if scenarios before we introduce more complexity. It is for individual firms to determine the best approach for their own firm. The guide is organized into 4 main sections, which we will cover in our webinar and summarize the key insights. The climate scenarios for the financial services industry section focuses on the types of questions that can be answered using scenario analysis and how firms can identify their potential exposures to climate-related financial risk. Scenario Identification and Development section discusses how firms can identify and develop suitable climate-related scenarios, taking into account their potential exposures. Scenario Assessment section looks at the assessment of quantifiable risk and deals with how firms can then assess the financial impact of those scenarios on their business. Finally, we'll consider the key challenges and barriers facing the financial industry's use of scenario analysis. Before we commence the process of developing and assessing the impact of climate-related financial risk and opportunities, as well as how the results will be used, it is important to be clear what questions or business decisions the scenario analysis is intended to help the firm address. For example, climate scenario analysis can help firms better identify the climate-related financial risk and opportunities and thereby guide successful corporate strategies. It can also inform how the company will perform under different future states, and a better understanding of the scenarios allow firms to anticipate the macro financial consequences of selected temperature and emission pathways. Others also rely on scenario analysis to test the alignment of a firm's business, investment portfolio, or funds with a specific pathway such as a 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees scenario. A further use of scenario analysis is to examine how much stress a firm can withstand before its business model fails, or what is known as reverse stress testing. For this type of analysis, a firm will design a scenario that tests its business plan to failure. In the case of a climate-specific reverse stress test, firms might consider sources of transition and physical risk that will be particularly difficult for the firm to withstand. For example, how might an abrupt change in consumer preferences impact a firm's profitability? Will this be enough to lead to failure, or should it be coupled with other risks such as weather-related disruption? Next, we turn to how we can identify potential exposures to climate-related financial risk and opportunities and assess their materiality. The 3 steps required to identify potential exposures are: first, examine both the physical and transition transmission channels. Second, to identify the climate-related financial risk and opportunities. And third, to conduct exposure analysis and assess materiality. When identifying climate-related financial risk, firms should examine how both transition and physical channels could impact their business currently and in the future. The impact will depend on a firm's business model, as well as the composition of their balance sheet. Climate change is expected to lead to an increase in the frequency and severity of acute weather-related events, as well as longer-term chronic shifts in climate. The continued rise in emissions will lead to higher average temperatures with significant socio-economic impacts expected above 2 degrees. The direct impacts arising from acute physical events, for example, flood, or chronic physical effects could be seen in the loss of output and cost of repair, in turn hurting the corporate balance sheets. Long-term chronic changes in climate patterns, as well as the broader impact of extreme events, could lead to disruption to a supply chain or support and adaptation costs being borne by the sovereign. This could have indirect effects on inflation, interest rates, and long-term productivity. Transition risk and opportunities can operate through a number of transmission channels. The assessment of these channels may include key components that contribute to lower emission pathways and their economic consequences. For example, the use of renewable energy sources, increased electrification, as well as consumer behavior, for example, less flying, less food waste, adjusted diets. Transition risk channels have both direct and indirect impacts. In terms of direct impacts, as climate policies penalize fossil fuel production as well as the production and use of emission-intensive goods and services, firms will face direct risk from stranded assets, negative movements in bond and equity valuations, changes in cash flows, and a deterioration in the credit risk profile of customers in affected sectors. At the same time, climate policies and technological development will promote firms involved in the production of goods and services that assist in reducing emissions. Firms need to assess these negative and positive direct transition impacts. Climate policies will also have broader indirect consequences by changing the prices of a broad basket of goods and services, affecting aggregate patterns of demand and supply. Risk identification is a process used by firms to identify, register, and monitor risks that are relevant to their business model. Two complementary approaches that firms can take to start identifying climate-related financial risk. So first is to start from the business profile and risk register of firms and question which business areas or risks are vulnerable to the physical effects of climate change or the transition to a low carbon economy. For example, how might changes in carbon prices affect credit risk profiles of firms in the manufacturing sectors? Or second, start with a future climate scenario and consider how macroeconomic variables such as GDP and unemployment that are used in existing financial risk assessments could be affected. Firms need to source relevant data to assess the exposure to material climate risk. For example, having data on the location of suppliers, facilities, customers, and sales is important for transition and physical channels. Firms could also source Scope 1, 2, and 3 GHG emissions data about their exposures as an initial guide to their exposure to transition risk. To ensure a relevant and proportionate approach with respect to these data, firms may wish to focus on exposures with the highest carbon intensities and longer durations, as well as examine the type of the financial relationship, for example, a lending commitment, bond underwriting, or other. Having considered firms' potential exposures to transition and physical risk, we will examine how firms can identify and develop suitable climate-related scenarios. A climate scenario can typically be described using a combination of the following components: socio-economic context, technological evolution, climate policy landscape, as well as emissions pathways and associated changes in the physical atmosphere. Firms may choose to analyze only one of these components or may decide that analysis should cover several of these components. This will depend on the context of the business decision needed to be answered, as well as the type and materiality of exposures. The socio-economic context lays out the scenario backdrop, defining the economy's tolerance for climate change. Technological evolution influences the economy's ability to effect and cope with transition. Climate policies will impact emissions either directly through imposing taxes or quantity restrictions on emissions, or indirectly, for example, through regulations on technology, materials, and efficiency. The emissions pathway represents trajectories of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. These concentrations result from the interaction of the three previous factors and influence the scale and nature of physical climate impacts. Different pathways reinforce or abate the socio-economic challenges. We turn now to some of the data sources. In terms of some of the models out there that focus on technology, we want to introduce the Energy Technology Perspectives, or ETP, modeling efforts by the IEA that explores both a 2 degrees aligned scenario and a beyond 2 degrees scenario, which tests the limits of new technology deployment and keeps average global warming below 1.75 degrees. No assumptions are made about new groundbreaking technologies. The Bloomberg New Energy Finance, or BNEF, releases their New Energy Outlook report on an annual basis. This report is an economic forecast of the evolution of the electricity system to 2050, focusing on meeting demand using least cost technology options. We also have models that focus on climate policy. The World Energy Outlook model by the IEA explores how future energy demand can be met under different levels of climate policy ambition. Also, the UNEP Principles for Responsible Investment, or PRI, explores an alternative policy scenario focusing on the near term inevitable policy response, or IPR, to climate change. The idea of this set of policy forecasts is to highlight that the policy response is inevitable once the realities of climate change become apparent. The IPR forecasts policies by 2025 that will be forceful, abrupt, and disorderly due to the delay. Unlike scenarios which require a basic understanding of climate science, these forecasts provide a tool to help businesses think about what policy and technological developments are likely to occur over a time horizon that is immediately relevant to businesses. As for models that focus on emissions pathways, the IPCC maintains the representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, which model changes in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases at different radiative levels. Firms may choose to combine the 4 components: socio-economic pathways, policy ambition, technological evolution, and emissions pathways, and explore their interdependencies either through bespoke models or off-the-shelf models. Our next section is scenario assessment. Scenario assessment allows a firm to model and quantify exposure to physical and transition risk. When assessing exposures to physical and transition risk, firms need to first define a risk measure to assess the impact of climate-related risk and opportunities, for example, credit ratings, enterprise value, or market valuations, along an appropriate time horizon over which changes will be assessed. Firms also need to consider what baseline to measure those changes against and what management actions should be considered. Also, choose impact assessment tools to analyze the change in the chosen risk matrix for a given scenario. For example, consider whether tools that look at the impact distribution by country, sector, asset class, for example, are appropriate, or whether tools that assess the impact of decarbonization and physical events on individual companies or specific assets are required. Assess the financial impacts and translate these impacts into financial metrics used in decision making. For example, profit and loss statements and capital ratios. Firms should also take appropriate action and conduct follow-up analysis if required. In terms of defining risk measure, when we assess climate scenarios, firms need to measure the impact of climate-related financial risk drivers, either transition or physical or both, on their key financial metrics. This would mean quantifying through a variety of transmission channels. Firms also need to consider suitable time horizons For the assessment of climate scenarios, these will in part depend on the business decision being analyzed and the duration of firms' exposures. Climate change is typically characterized as having a long time horizon. A long time horizon also helps to understand the nature of transitions that could occur and the time taken for decarbonization goals to be achieved. Off-the-shelf scenario analysis, as discussed in the previous section, may offer ready-to-use benchmark or reference scenarios that firms could use as a starting point to define a baseline. Firms should bear in mind when choosing a baseline the high level of uncertainty. For example, even if a specific carbon reduction pathway is selected as a baseline, climate science shows that in the long run, it can lead to a variety of temperature outcomes and in turn, multiple manifestations of physical events with different degrees of severity and incidence. At the core, firms need to think through and be very clear in what assumptions they are making. Firms should also consider management actions when defining the risk measure. To explain a bit more about impact assessment tools, firms need to select the appropriate impact assessment tools to analyze the change in the chosen risk matrix for a given scenario. The use of these tools will depend on a firm's specific needs. For example, whether it is a bank, fund manager, or an insurer, what risk type or risk measure they want to test, and which part of the business or balance sheet they want to stress. Tools tend to fall into the following two broad categories, which differ by granularity. So they could be macroeconomic impact assessment tools that provide an assessment of the macro financial transmission and will be typically modeled with macroeconomic parameters. Or they could be asset or company-specific impact assessment tools. These start with a granular assessment of the impact of decarbonization and physical events on individual companies or specific assets, for example, real estate and fixed capital, etc. And I think the third stage will be when we talk about assessing financial impacts. And firms should assess these financial impacts and translate these impacts into financial metrics to be used to inform decision making. For example, P&L statement and capital ratios. This translation should be comparable with the way these metrics are already incorporated in decision making, while noting the potential differences in the time horizon and the baseline used. Depending on the insights from the analysis, firms may decide to take actions or undertake follow-up analysis. In the next section, we will consider the challenges and barriers in performing scenario analysis. The first challenge is the breadth and magnitude of transition and physical risk. It is hard to know where to start and which effects to prioritize in analysis. The risk will likely be correlated and potentially aggravated by tipping points in a non-linear fashion. The impacts could be much larger and more widespread and diverse than those of other structural changes. It is crucial to specify the purpose of the scenario and to focus its design on the most relevant components. It may be preferable to start with a simplified outline scenario using existing research, data, and models, and iterate, adding additional elements where material. The large amount and wide variety of off-the-shelf research, data, and models available is itself a challenge, so a clear focus on purpose will help to determine the approach and sources to utilize and the nature and granularity of output needed. The second challenge relates to extended and uncertain time horizons and feedback loops. The time horizons over which climate-related financial risks may be realized are uncertain, and their full impact may crystallize beyond most current business planning horizons. The way to do this is to list the different ways in which key financial indicators of interest might have a high, medium, or low value due to climate-related factors by the future timeframes of interest. A second step could be to then consider the consequences of these changes occurring in a variety of simple time sequences. Creating probability distributions for these outcomes either needs to be done very carefully, or this step may not always be needed. The third challenge is in terms of many economic models of climate impacts perform poorly in higher warming scenarios because economic models tend to have mild or simplistic damage functions that fail to respond in a way that is consistent with the scientific analysis and expectations. Although the complexity of systemic impact puts people off, we should not delay action until some theoretical perfect model exists. The fourth challenge is in the area of data gaps and comparability of disclosures. Firms may need to use additional metrics requiring new data and new modeling methods to capture climate impacts on the economy and their business. In the short term, the use of reference scenarios and good disclosure about scenario selection and design will be the key mitigants. Key regulatory authorities, institutional investors, banks, and stock exchanges are increasingly signaling that mandatory disclosure requirements are approaching or have already been implemented. Over the last few years, such signals have helped to broaden the number of companies that are making climate-related financial disclosures, as well as increasing the level of granularity of disclosures. The fifth challenge we'll examine is cognitive bias. For example, people unconsciously assess probability of a future event or outcome on the basis of how easily they can remember past examples or how easily they can imagine possible events. It may be possible to agree some standardization of key variables used in scenario analysis. However, to avoid some cognitive biases, it is important to use scenario analysis to assess a wide range of potential future outcomes, particularly outcomes that might seem unlikely today. Scenario analysis, in summary, is a process for identifying and assessing the potential implications of a range of plausible future states under conditions of uncertainty. Scenarios enable an organization to explore and understand how various combinations of climate-related risk, both transition and physical risk, may affect its businesses, strategies, and financial performance over time. The choice of approach to scenario analysis, whether qualitative or quantitative, will depend on an organization's needs, resources, and capabilities. The Tcfd recommends the use of temperature-based scenarios as well as for organizations to use a 2 degrees or lower scenario in addition to 2 or 3 other scenarios most relevant to their circumstances. The disclosure of organizations' forward-looking assessments of climate-related issues is also important for investors and other stakeholders in understanding how vulnerable individual organizations are to transition and physical risk and how such vulnerabilities are or would be addressed. The CFR's Guide on Scenario Analysis chapter is another resource on how to use scenario analysis to assess climate-related financial risk to inform firm strategy and business decisions. The chapter focuses on climate scenarios for the financial services industry, scenario identification and development, as well as scenario assessment. The guide also recognizes a number of challenges and barriers in performing scenario analysis. We have covered a number of issues during our webinar, so it's time to put everything together. We now turn to a case study to apply what we have learned. For this case study, we have picked Indorama Ventures, or what we call IVL, which is a Thailand-based holding company. It invests in various companies in domestic and international markets across business areas, including the manufacture and sale of polyethylene terephthalate, or PET, which is used for beverage containers and food packaging, the manufacture and sale of polyester fibers and yarns, which are used for textile and industrial applications, the production and trade of purified terephthalic acid, or PTA, which is a white powder used in the production of polyester products. To set the context, the chemical sector supplies a broad range of products that serve a range of markets and industries. The chemical sector is a large energy user and GHG emitter and faces risks associated with climate change and other sustainability issues. IVL is a supporter of Tcfd, and we would like to examine how the company implements the Tcfd recommendations with specific focus on the risk management category. In the earlier part of our webinar, we discussed effective governance to manage climate risk. As you can see on this slide, there is evidence of clear roles, responsibilities, and accountability across the company. This structure also facilitates controls to be embedded into relevant processes. The next slide captures an overview of the climate risk and opportunities identified. Climate risks are analyzed and categorized as physical risk and transition risk, while the climate-related opportunities are not only classified but also described. It is also worth noting that the company has attached a time horizon to the various climate risks, which enables investors and other stakeholders to glean how climate issues could affect its businesses, strategies, and financial performance over time. In terms of areas for improvement, the set of climate risk and opportunities identified by IVL are generic in nature and could be further tailored to be more specific to the company. Additional detail could be added to explain the specific external factors and how this might impact the company and what specific opportunities could be actively pursued. Recognizing a number of key climate risks, IVL conducted scenario analysis to understand its exposure to both physical and transition risk. On this slide, we focus on one of IVL's examples related to water stress. Water risk has been identified by IVL as a key climate-related risk. In 2020, a water sensitivity analysis using the aqueduct water risk tool developed by the World Resources Institute was conducted to identify water stress locations. The tool helped them evaluate changes in water demand, water supply, stakeholder risk, and regulations based on current and future conditions. It also enabled them to foresee changes to water risk forecasting in 2020, 2030, and 2040. These results, in turn, enable the company to identify the necessary mitigation measures and any meaningful initiatives for IVL's operations in areas facing extreme water stress or significant risk to water usage. Another scenario which the company considered is the rising carbon price in view of tightening regulations. Through the use of financial impact modeling, IVL is better positioned to anticipate its rising compliance costs and to inform management's decision-making. To further improve the analysis, IVL could consider the impact of carbon pricing under different scenarios, for example, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees scenario, as carbon prices are likely to differ, and this should be accounted for. And so that brings me to the end of our webinar today, and thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Cindy, for your very comprehensive presentation. Now, let's move on to our next session, which is Q&A. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, saat ini mari kita masuk ke dalam sesi tanya jawab. Tapi sebelumnya kita akan ada polling seperti webinar kita di awal bulan Juni lalu. Kami akan mengadakan polling untuk terkait program training ini. Dan ini sebetulnya untuk membantu polling ini adalah untuk membantu kami dalam meningkatkan kualitas dari webinar yang akan datang. Jadi kami mohon partisipasi Bapak dan Ibu sekalian untuk mengisi survei sebagai umpan balik untuk sesi hari ini. Bagaimana cara mengisi survei ini? Silahkan klik tautan atau scan QR code yang ada di layar Anda. Anda juga dapat mengakses tautan yang kami tulis di chat box untuk mengisi survei ini. Kami sangat mengharapkan partisipasi Anda dalam mengisi survei ini, supaya kami dapat memperbaiki konten maupun bagaimana kami membawakan webinar kami di masa yang akan datang. Ada beberapa hal yang penting yang Bapak dan Ibu perlu ketahui sebelum menjawab survei. Dalam formulir surveinya, mohon Bapak dan Ibu, seperti Bapak dan Ibu lihat di layar, pilih jawaban multi-country di kolom select the country. Harap pilih jawaban multi-country. Lalu untuk di kolom select the implementer of the training, mohon pilih CDP worldwide. Dan yang terakhir di kolom select the name of the training, silahkan pilih Advanced Workshop on Tcfd and SDGs led by CDP and GRI sebagai nama dari training hari ini. Jadi mohon pilih ketiga jawaban tersebut sebelum mengisi polling kami. Saya akan beri waktu sekitar 30 detik untuk Bapak dan Ibu sekalian supaya punya waktu untuk mengisi formulir ini. Sembari menunggu formulir diisi, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, bagi Anda yang memiliki pertanyaan tapi belum menuliskan pertanyaan Anda dalam kolom Q&A, mohon atau silahkan kirimkan pertanyaan Anda, tuliskan pertanyaan Anda dalam kolom Q&A. Tadi penjelasan dari Cindy sudah sangat komprehensif dan saya yakin beberapa penjelasan tersebut sesuai dengan kondisi dari perusahaan yang Bapak dan Ibu sekalian saat ini bekerja. Jadi saya himbau untuk menggunakan kesempatan ini untuk menanyakan hal-hal yang masih belum jelas kepada Cindy. Baiklah, 30 detik sudah berlalu, langsung saja saya akan mulai Q&A, sesi Q&A, tapi sebelumnya ada lagi informasi dari kami, yaitu di besok tanggal 30 Juni, hari Rabu tanggal 30 Juni, saya ingin mengingatkan bahwa partner kami, GRI, akan mengadakan workshop yang akan membahas bagaimana perusahaan dapat menyelaraskan strategi bisnis perusahaan dengan SDGs dan United Nations Global Compact Women Empowerment Principle atau WEP, dan bagaimana perusahaan dapat mengukur dampaknya. Lalu di bulan-bulan mendatang akan ada webinar lanjutan terkait rekomendasi Tcfd. Kami sangat berharap Bapak dan Ibu sekalian dapat bergabung dalam training-training mendatang, dan juga dalam beberapa bulan ke depan kami akan mengirimkan undangan terkait webinar yang Anda lihat di layar ini yang nantinya akan didiseminasikan oleh rekan-rekan kami di IDX. Pastikan Anda menerima undangan tersebut. Jangan lupa Bapak dan Ibu, mohon diisi formulir untuk feedback-nya. Langsung saja, sekarang kita masuki sesi tanya jawab. Saya juga akan panggilkan rekan saya Fred untuk memoderasi sesi tanya jawab ini. Fred, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rini. Maybe we can just keep the QR code on the slide while we complete the Q&A. So we have a few questions. Thank you for submitting them. And yeah, we have 5 minutes. So if you have questions, please keep them coming. So the first question is, where can you see CDP responses in full? So if you go to our website, cdp.net, then you can access thousands of companies' full responses. And you can just scroll down on the page where you can see a box that says search a company response. But please note that you have to sign in to access the responses, and it's completely free and everything. So so you could do that. We will also share the recording and the slide decks with everyone. And then we have one question here. Maybe I can give a quick answer from CDP sides and see, Rini, if you have anything to add. So what is your recommendation based on observation in your work as to how often to review in a year the environmental risk assessment? And so from CDP side, this is one of the questions in our questionnaire that is also scored. And what we consider best practice for environmental risk assessments on the leadership level is to do it more than once a year. And importantly, to also consider, long, medium and short-term time horizons, and in addition to that, looking beyond your direct operations to your value chain up and downstream are also important. But I do think a large majority of the companies that I've seen, they will do it usually once a year. Rini, anything you would like to add to this one?
I think it's also not it's also to consider not just in terms of frequency, but what is the process and what is being examined when we talk about reviewing, right? So I think importantly, as Fred also mentioned, at the board level, it's important that they are provided the right information to understand the exposures to climate risks and opportunities. And we always stress the importance of ensuring that there is proper channel of communication between the management and the board, and to ensure that the board has sufficient information to be able to make decisions. I think increasingly, it's also to consider what are these regulatory, reputation, and legal obligations. And I think that's the part that, requires a lot more guidance in terms of from the government, policymakers. How do we anticipate some of these regulations arising, or carbon tax, or any other forms of guidance or policies around maybe sustainable procurement, so on and so forth. So I think in the whole process of doing reviewing environmental risk assessment, I think it's not just about internal, but also taking into account external factors. And when they arise, that's when it's worth also revisiting some of the assumptions made, and also some of the current parameters that are being used to assess the risk at an organization level.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And maybe following on that, one very relevant question and some praise also, Rini says, Rini, great presentation. The principles are simple, but at the same time complicated. We are lacking data and information for assumptions, scenario, and analysis. If a company starts with a simple approach, i.e., for example, a 3-year time span, would that be okay? And maybe if you know where, what are the sources for these assumptions, etc.
Right, thank you so much for the feedback, and I think this is really important question, not just in Indonesia, but also in the other countries that we work with. They have a lot of questions around data availability. So if I may point us to also some of the resources out there, if you look at the Tcfd, apart from the recommendations, they have a technical supplement, and the supplement provides some of the possible resources you can use, for example, in terms of the understanding scenario analysis. So one example I would point us to is the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, or IIASA. So this is an avenue that provides a wide variety of land, energy, transition, and water tools, as well as online databases. And some of the online databases that it provides will also include scenario databases for energy, GHG mitigation strategies, and also the climate policies that are consistent with a 2 degrees and IPCC scenarios. So that's one avenue that you could look to be able to extract the relevant information for your scenario analysis.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shini. And we are 1 minute over time. So Rini, I'll hand it back to you, but thank you very much everyone for attending and for providing feedback through the link on the screen.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you for moderating the Q&A session. Thank you very much, Shini, for great explanation and very comprehensive presentation. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, karena waktu kita sudah habis, kami akan tutup sesi tanya jawab terakhir pada hari ini. Bagi pertanyaan yang belum dapat terjawab, kami akan mengirimkan semua pertanyaan dan jawaban beserta rekaman dari presentasi kita hari ini sesudah acara berlangsung. Atas nama penyelenggara dan juga rekan-rekan dari GRI, rekan-rekan dari Indonesia Stock Exchange, dan rekan-rekan dari CDP, dan juga Miss Laushini, thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak atas partisipasi Anda dan support-nya untuk jalannya webinar ini. Mohon maaf jika ada kekurangan. Sampai bertemu di acara-acara webinar CDP GRI mendatang. Selamat siang. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. See you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Fred. Thank you, everyone.
Ya, terima kasih semuanya.